Yes, I'm going to talk about queering national cultural institutions. Here we go, Sheila na gig. I love my Sheilas. Not an image you see every day when you walk into the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin's Kildare Street. They're distributed around Spain, Portugal, Britain, but the biggest concentration of them is in Ireland. They're over church doorways, walls, early Anglo-Norman. They start to proliferate in the early Anglo-Norman period. The National Museum has actually lifted some of them off their original sites and actually deposited them in the bowels of Kildare Street. And you have to actually make an appointment to see them. Possibly because some censorious Victorian keeper decided that they were a little bit too much for our delicate and sensitive minds. But I'd actually rather imagine it was probably De Valera and his boyos in the early days of the Irish Free State. And they were all boyos in those days, making the decisions on our cultural behalf. Middle-aged men deciding what we could see, what films we could watch, what films deserved censorship, what icons deserved to be shared amongst us, how we actually interpreted our culture, how we defined our sense of Irish identity. So somebody anyway decided to lock them in the bowels of the National Museum on Dublin's Kildare Street. And I'd like to use our Sheilas, this exuberant display of female sexuality that have been interpreted. Their name is contested. Sheila na gig is still contested in Irish and in English. Their meaning has been lost in time. It's contested as well. But I think the Sheilas are emblematic of how we queer our national cultural institutions. And when I say queer, I'm specifically thinking of LGBTI people, Irish people, but I'm also thinking of, well, how LGBTI people see themselves reflected back in our national cultural institutions, how they also exploit those collections, but also to how we engage, how we seek out and subvert heteronormative and ethnographic discourse in our heavy hitters like the National Museum of Ireland, the National Gallery of Ireland, the National Library of Ireland. And what I really mean is, you know, going into these institutions and seeing ourselves reflected back. And I think it's particularly important. It's particularly important in the times we live in. I won't mention the B word, but since the Good Friday Agreement, where we've actually reframed a complex notion of Irish cultural and ethnic identity, where we've, since the mid-90s, for the first time since the famine, we've actually had net immigration, and that has actually forced us to think about what it means to be Irish, what it means to be multicultural. All of these things are still going on, and they're gathering pace. And I'm curious how we actually make sense of all of that. The criminal law that pertained around sexual behavior and specifically homosexuality and fertility, women's fertility, I'm thinking of the Offences Against the Person Act of 1861, really noxious Victorian legislation that outlawed divorce, outlawed abortion, outlawed sex between men, outlawed soliciting, and most of that legislative framework remained on statute books up until 20 years ago. Contraceptives were legalized in 1991, divorce in 1995, sex between men in 1993, and of course the abortion legislation, as you all know, last year. It's impossible to overstate the impact of criminal law as it affected sexual identity and sexual expression. And I want you to imagine how it bared down on the Irish state, the early days of the Irish state, as we tried to frame our identity as Irish people and how we sort of created liberation myths about Ireland. These laws are pressed down us and basically stopped Irish society from really engaging with its sexual minorities. And all that would change in 1993 when, by a gorgeous stroke of luck, President Mary Robinson, Ireland's first woman president, and actually the woman who'd campaigned as a senior counsel for 11 years to actually remove those noxious Victorian noxious Victorian legislation, ends up signing into law a new piece of legislation that not only made rape a gender-neutral crime, but it also introduced a common age of consent of 17 for everyone. And that moment is a really extraordinary, I mean, for those of us who witnessed the hullabaloo of marriage equality 4 years ago, and that in itself, I'll come to in a moment, was indeed a really extraordinarily pivotal moment in Irish society. But decriminalisation was quite extraordinary. I mean, to somebody like me, it didn't matter fuck. You know, one day I'm a criminal, the next day I'm not. You know, and in some ways I enjoy being a criminal because it meant for all of you heterosexuals, I wasn't bound by your rule book. I could just tear it up, make up my own rules as I went along. But of course, I suffered all of the social opprobrium and taboo and transgressiveness that came with that criminality. But as soon as it's removed, something extraordinary happens in Irish society. It's like the removal of the criminal law gave mainstream Ireland a license to engage with its sexual minorities. It actually allowed it to wake up and go, oh, you've been there all along. And now I no longer have the fear. And now I can actually embrace, with some great meaningful empathy, I can embrace your fears and your concerns that you've carried with you all this time. I can embrace your hurt. We can start talking about it. I can embrace your dreams and aspirations. And through that, actually engage in a much more complex public discourse about the type of society we want to build for ourselves, not just for our sexual minorities, but inter alia for all of us. I'm always reminded of a great quote we had in Ireland's first Gay Pride week in 1980. I was a 19-year-old. You know, it's like you're 19, you're conceited as hell and, you know, full of sort of this passion about wanting to go out and change the world. And there was this motto that was used that said, gay liberation is your liberation. And me being a sort of conceited 19-year-old thought it was speaking to me. It was only years later I realized actually it was speaking to mainstream Ireland. It was saying, you know, we liberate the gays and everybody else is liberated in that process. And we've seen that at work between the great pivotal moments of decriminalisation in 1993 and marriage equality in 2015. Something shifted. I mean, of course, the lazy shorthands, we use these big moments like repeal last year or like the vote on June 23rd. I was writing the eulogy for my mother's funeral, so it's a bittersweet memory for me. Her funeral lunch the following day. But the lazy shorthand is something massive change, especially for the international media, going, oh, Ireland's finally sloughing off its sort of feudalism and all of that sort of ropey Roman Catholic morality that's so sort of constrained people over the years. But actually, as we all know, any of us who are as slithering towards 60 like I am, actually that change has been happening all along. But we needed some big moments to remind ourselves how proud we are to be on that right side of history, and to also to open ourselves up to the ever-growing sense of collective empathy that we've been developing, and how that feeds into the public discourse about what type of society we want to grow older in, what type of society we want for our children and our grandchildren. You know, notions of fairness and tolerance. And in some ways, you know, it seems to me that in the last few years, between gay law reform in 1993, 25 years ago, and marriage equality and repeal, something really significant has happened. It's like we've actually reached back into our history. We've reached back and we've dug deep and we've actually rediscovered, you know, all of our strengths as a society. And that's actually really important because it informs how we view ourselves and how we ask to be viewed in our national constitutional institutions. Back in 2008, at the height, I suppose, of the septic tiger, a huge amount of materials had been collected by many individuals and organisations since the foundation days in the early 70s of the Irish lesbian gay civil rights movement. An enormous amount of material was transferred into the National Library of Ireland. And it was a really significant moment. The symbolism was huge. It was meant for the first time, the Irish state was actually taking ownership of LGBT heritage. It was saying, this has a value, your life has a value, your lived experience, your struggle has a value. And we're going to stitch it back into, we're going to start the process of stitching it back into, you know, our formal historical narratives, and hopefully arrive at a point where we'll see it reflected back at us in, say, the educational system, you know, and whatnot. The collection is quite extraordinary, because it not only reflects lived experience, there's people's personal papers, there's a huge amount of ephemera, posters, flyers, badges, ephemera, you know. And what's lovely about that is it reflects another narrative arc of lived experience. You know, we're all really familiar with how people change laws, the criminal law particularly. You know, that process has been laid bare. It's been publicized a lot through film and documentary and TV and people's memoirs and everything. But the lived experience of what I call ordinary people being extraordinary, I think that's a really powerful thing. And all of that, ordinary people being extraordinary, ordinary people, like all of us in this room, going out and being brave enough to just live our own life and be real enough and speak truth to our power. And through that process, actually inform and enable other people to find their voice. It's a really powerful and subversive thing, actually. To me, it's hugely important how then we find some evidence of that experience and make an effort to actually preserve it. Now, around the same time that the Irish Queer Archive was being transferred to the National Library of Ireland, the government introduced the National Cultural Institutions Act of 1997. I don't expect you to read it, okay, especially that's but actually, I made the effort on your behalf to read all 48 pages of it. And it's all really about things like refining the board and management and organisation of the National Museum of Ireland, the National Library of Ireland, and to a lesser extent the Chester Beatty, the National Gallery and the Chester Beatty Library and Museum. But what really struck me was a section that talked about, essentially, it really laid out in very simple terms the remit of these national institutions. The principal functions of the museum shall be to maintain, manage, control, protect, preserve, record, research, and, here's the kicker, enlarge the collection of museum heritage objects for the benefit of the public, and to increase and diffuse in and outside the state knowledge of human life in Ireland. Well, that's wide open as far as I'm concerned. And if you've got the energy and the remit, you know, that's an invitation to just get in there and make it happen. And interesting enough, the Act also, for the first time ever, sets out gender parity in the constitution of the boards of managements of these institutions as well. Now, while this is all happening, since all that's happening, something interesting has bubbled up. It's been going on, it's been enabled by this legislation, by things like the transfer of the Irish Queer Archive, because it's a significant collection, the Irish Queer Archive. Colm Tobin, our celebrated writer, made a very good point at the transfer. He said, you cannot write a history of 20th century Ireland. You cannot write a history of modern Ireland without referencing the Irish Queer Archive. Regardless of your sexual orientation, regardless of your gender, all our histories are contained there. And it's not just because we know a gay or we know a trans person and we know an intersex person, but he's right, all our histories, because it is fundamentally a story when we drill down. It's a fundamental story of a society in change, a society finding itself, a society sloughing off that fusism I mentioned earlier on, a society actually beginning to grow up and find its collective voice. Excuse me, part of that process has also involved recently the National Library of Ireland developing a strategy that pivots on notions of inclusion and diversity. And then asks the question, how do we actually realise these, how do we realise this policy? And of course, not to be outdone, the National Museum of Ireland this year launched its Rainbow Revolution Trail. And you know, we live in really interesting times. I mean, it is an absolute privilege, to be here, to live in Ireland right now, and to be a part of the extraordinary, vital change that's happening here, and also how that's reflected out there in the wider world. But when I saw the National Museum of Ireland in Collins Barracks, which of course is like the Victoria and Albert Museum of Ireland, decorative arts, when I saw them actually taking the wedding dress of Dr. Catherine Zappone, I thought, wow, we've come the distance. Here's a woman who actually, with her deceased wife, essentially kick-started the whole marriage equality debate by taking a constitutional action with her wife to make the revenue taxed to them as any married couple. Now she ends up being Minister for Family, a lesbian minister who's actually heading the Department of Children and Family, something that would have been unthinkable even 20 years ago, certainly unthinkable before the Catholic Church imploded through sex abuse scandals and reframed the cultural stereotypes of gay men and women being predatory child abusers and all that sort of thing. So we live in really exciting times. The National Museum is having this conversation and also going, it's about time that we actually reflected not only the lived experience, but here's the thing too. Oh, actually, I want to show you this one as well. Everyone's in on the game. So the National Gallery of Ireland this year decided to run an event, celebrate LGBT History Month in February. They held it in March, though, with a series of panel discussions and also following Amanda Coogan's extraordinary performance, feminist performance through the building, where she actually took women's groups through the National Gallery of Ireland and attempted to identify not only women painters, but to also critique the underrepresentation of women in the national collection on Merrion Square. But here's the thing, all of these massive undertakings by the major institutions are reflective of a number of things that have been happening. It's not just changes in state policy, but it's also a new generation of archivists, historians, keepers, and curators. I don't mean a new generation that are specifically LGBT, but a new generation who are better educated, who have a greater sort of political and cultural new, and who are woke, essentially, and who are eager to see themselves and their friends and their families reflected back at them in collections that previously simply refused or were reluctant to actually display those collections, not unlike the Sheila na Gig and everything that Sheila na Gig represents. We cannot leave it, in the exciting times we live in, we cannot leave it to that new generation of keepers. We cannot leave it to those institutions to do that work on our own behalf. I think it behoves us as cultural consumers and as people who are excited to see ourselves living right now in these magical, transformative, historical times to also go, what can I do? What can I do when I don't see myself represented? When I don't see myself represented down in IMRA, I don't see myself represented in a collection of art in the National Gallery of Ireland. That's where we need to take it and be mindful of our own responsibility. Thank you.